For 10 years, dozens of countries have been trying to overthrow the Syrian government. It's not just the United States and its Western allies. Arab countries in the Middle East have also been implicated in this plan. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others took an active role in the war on Syria, throwing money, weapons, and unlimited support behind various terrorist groups. Other Arab countries like Egypt and Jordan stood idly by, distancing themselves from Syria and passively towing the official narrative that President Bashar al-Assad must be removed. Fast forward to 2021, and now those same countries are trying to normalize ties with the Syrian government. Ostensibly, the United States is fuming as its regional allies in the Middle East seek rapprochement with Damascus. So why now? What's the strategy here? Are these countries acting on their own accord, or did they get the prior okay first from Washington? How come these countries want to buddy up again with Syria, and how does it benefit both sides? Aside from trying to topple the Syrian government, the United States has claimed since 2014 that it's busy launching limited precision strikes against Daesh inside Iraq and Syria. Is it? That's not what the latest investigation by the New York Times says. A recent report shows that US forces killed dozens of Syrian women and children in 2019 and then tried covering it up, literally by bulldozing the site, so no one would find out. I'm Richard Medhurst, and you're watching the Communiqué. The war on Syria began in 2011 during the protests of the Arab Spring. While Egypt and Tunisia experienced enormous popular uprisings, that's not quite what happened in Libya and Syria. Syria had protests to a certain degree, but it quickly became apparent who and what was behind these calls to topple the government. It wasn't just Syrians out on the streets protesting, seeking change and an overhaul of the system. It was also foreign governments trying to change the political landscape in the Middle East, who were meddling inside Syria and trying to bring about regime change. These foreign governments and their terrorist proxies soon proved to be the most dominant actors in the war on Syria. The United States, United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Israel, Turkey, and many others were sending money, arms, and training terrorist groups inside Syria. This is a well-documented fact. These same countries tried to isolate Syria in the international community and the United Nations. Syria's diplomatic ties have been severed with dozens of countries. The list is too long to mention. And they put Syria under heavy sanctions, both the US and the European Union. Many cut ties, and that was that. Syria was isolated, and still is today to an extraordinary degree. Syria, whose nickname in Arabic is Qalb al-Arub al-Nabita, the beating heart of Arabism, was even kicked out of the Arab League. That's how much the politics in the region were manipulated against Syria. The Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, was smuggling weapons from Libya to Syria to support terrorist groups fighting the government. But some Arab countries were also supporting their own groups in Syria. Qatar was funding terrorist groups like Faylaq al-Rahman or Jabhat al-Nusra, which is essentially a rebrand of Al-Qaeda. Meanwhile, the Saudis threw their support behind organizations like Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Sham. Fast forward to 2021, and now the situation is completely different. Despite throwing all this money and sending all these foreign fighters to Syria, it didn't work. The last couple of months, we've seen an extraordinary shift as many Arab countries have indicated their willingness for rapprochement with Damascus. A country like Saudi Arabia, which was funding terrorist groups to overthrow the Syrian government, is now saying it wants to mend ties with Syria as if nothing happened. Just look at this example from a few months ago in June from Al Jazeera. They reported Saudi Arabia is close to reaching an agreement on diplomatic normalization with President Bashar al-Assad's government. Incredible, isn't it? In September, Egypt and Jordan, who weren't on speaking terms with Syria since the beginning of the war, are now suddenly cooperating with al-Assad so they could send Egyptian gas and Jordanian power through Syria to help Lebanon. This was done at the behest of the United States, scared that Hezbollah was growing too popular in Lebanon. Later that same month, Reuters reported that Jordan's King Abdullah received a phone call from Syrian President al-Assad, the first since the start of the war in 2011. A week later, in early October, Jordan proceeded to open its main border crossing with Syria. During the latest UN General Assembly in New York, the Syrian foreign minister had meetings not just with the Egyptian foreign minister, but 8 other Arab foreign ministers. The latest sign of normalization came in early November from the United Arab Emirates. The foreign minister of the UAE, Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, came to Damascus to meet with al-Assad personally. Given all these recent developments, there's no doubt that we're seeing a huge shift in attitude from Arab countries towards Syria. But why is that exactly? To talk more, I wanted to bring on Tim Anderson. He joins me from the Syrian capital, Damascus. Tim is an Australian writer, activist, and academic. He's also the director of the Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies, a virtual network that was founded over concerns of academic body censorship on anti-imperial research. Tim, thanks so much for taking the time. It's a pleasure to have you on. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the rapprochement or normalization of ties with Syria. What do you think is behind this change in attitude? What has changed the equation here? Is it the president, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, or perhaps the advance of Yemeni forces as the Houthis are part of the resistance axis? Why exactly are we seeing so many Arab countries change their position in regards to Syria?
Yes, it's related to the whole region. You're right in that respect. And of course, the U.S. has always seen the whole region as its project, not individual wars. You know, there's been at least 8 wars, arguably 9 if we include Bahrain, in the last 20 years. And that's part of a project that was given a name, the New Middle East, 15 years ago by Condoleezza Rice when she was in Jerusalem, just before the Israelis invaded Lebanon again. So what's been happening is they've been losing several wars, as you mentioned. They withdrew from Afghanistan. They have a schedule to withdraw what they call combat troops from Iraq. That may be weasel words there. They are certainly in discussions at the moment to withdraw troops from Syria. And as you pointed out, the Saudis are in trouble in Yemen, and they've been suing for peace for the last couple of years, but they haven't proposed any decent sort of terms. So I think in that context, and also in the context of the contradictions of the economic blockade, let's not call them sanctions, the economic blockade against most of the independent countries here and the peoples of the region here, the the Biden administration, let's say, has had to start to make some adjustments. It made some adjustments for Lebanon when the country was on the verge of starving and not having any fuel. There was pressure from the Emiratis, who actually went and normalized with Damascus 3 years ago. And then Trump, of course, used that against them to force them to normalize with Israel. He blackmailed them on that one. But nevertheless, the Emiratis wanted to get back, and having lost the war of all the proxy armies they'd sent into Syria, some of those countries really, for their own reasons of investment and trade and whatever, wanted to reestablish ties with Syria and not be completely excluded. And so Jordan was the other one. Jordan, probably the weakest of all of the Arab countries, totally dependent on its relationship with the US, also did some sort of normalization recently. So I think you're seeing them, the UAE to a certain extent, certainly Jordan and Lebanon, getting permission from the US to reopen ties to a certain degree, against what the very strong third-party economic blockade measures that Trump put in place, called the Caesar sanctions. So the Biden administration has not removed those laws, but it's been making exceptions more or less while maintaining the framework of a large number of laws that constitute this blockade.
And that's a very interesting point, because I wanted to ask you about that. Do you think they're acting of their own accord, or they had to get an okay from the United States and Israel? Because it is a contradiction in how the United States views Syria and how they view Syria now.
Yes, the US certainly gave permission to Jordan, and I believe also to the Emiratis. Their foreign minister was here recently. It was a big deal. It was a diplomatic coup for Syria in a way. It was also a type of a green light for the Emiratis to proceed with investment project, which they've been looking at, and they have some in train, but they've been holding back for the last 3 years, but I believe that's now going ahead. So I think they needed permission from the US. Of course, remember, all of these collaborating states are very vulnerable to the US, and Trump proved that when he forced the Emiratis and Bahrain, wasn't it, to recognize Israel, the so-called, some other accord, some agreement where they...
Abraham Accords. Yeah.
Abraham Accords, that's right, yeah.
When Blinken, the Secretary of State, he says that the United States opposes any attempts to rehabilitate or normalize ties with Syria, is he just puffing his chest?
Yes, well, that's happening to a certain degree. I mean, it is bluster, but it's also, they know they've been fighting a losing war in Syria and Iraq for a number of years now. They are making they don't mind making exceptions for certain people, and by which they still hold the power to prevent things from happening, basically. But of course, it appears that there's big contradictions because the Lebanese are coming in, the Jordanians are coming in, the Emiratis are coming in. The Saudis have been talking to Damascus also, but that's not really out in the open yet. But nevertheless, the US is maintaining its posture that of a bad loser. I mean, they're always bad losers, aren't they? I recall Vietnam. They fought for at least 7 years, knowing that they were losing in Vietnam. Then they imposed so-called sanctions, a blockade on Vietnam for a number of years too, which persisted into the 80s. So that's why I wouldn't be surprised to see the occupation, US occupation. Remember, there's 3 occupations of Syria now. The 2 largest NATO armies, Turkey and the US, are occupying large parts of Syria, and of course Israel has been occupying the southern part for 50 years. So the US occupation is all along the border, the critical borders of Syria, on the eastern borders with Iraq, and also with Jordan, except for one point where al-Baghouz is. So one of the key points of the US occupation, I believe, is to prevent the links strengthening between Iran, Iraq, and Syria. That's really quite a critical part of their classical divide and rule strategy.
We'll be right back after this short break. You mentioned the massacre, which was unearthed by the New York Times recently. This article talks about a U.S. airstrike inside Syria near a town called Baghouz. On March 18th, 2019, American forces killed upwards of 60 Syrian civilians. Let me just read you a few lines from the article. A U.S. military drone circled high overhead, hunting for military targets, but it saw only a large crowd of women and children huddled against a riverbank. Without warning, an American F-15E attack jet streaked across the drone's high-definition field of vision and dropped a 500-pound bomb on the crowd, swallowing it in a shuddering blast. As the smoke cleared, a few people stumbled away in search of cover. Then a jet tracking them dropped one 2,000-pound bomb, then another, killing most of the survivors. They go on to say in the article that the assessments of the airstrike were carried out by the same unit which called in the airstrike. This is a unit called Task Force 9, right? So it's basically like the police department investigating itself for police brutality. And of course, this unit rarely found problems with its own work. No conflict of interest there, I'm sure. After this investigation, the New York Times sent its findings to U.S. Central Command. This is the response that it got. The command acknowledged the strikes for the first time, saying 80 people were killed, but the airstrikes were justified. It said the bombs killed 16 fighters and 4 civilians. As for the other 60 people, the statement said it was not clear that they were civilians, in part because women and children in the Islamic State sometimes took up arms. Right, so according to the statement, they just assume that the other 60 people they murdered were maybe combatants because sometimes women and children under Daesh took up arms. Well, it turns out this was also a lie, because in the article, people who saw the drone footage say there weren't 16 men at all. It was 2 or 3 men who were just walking around. They weren't even in combat. Now, this American unit, Task Force 9, was just going around Syria, murdering civilians, and then claiming it was self-defense. They see a car driving, they just claim it looks threatening, and then they call in an airstrike. Oh, we saw someone with a gun, call in an airstrike. They would lie and make up all sorts of things, anything to pretend that they were acting in self-defense. They actually did this so much that about 80% of all airstrikes called in by this unit were claimed in self-defense. And you can guess, of course, what that leads to. Thousands and thousands of civilians killed. In the article, they say that, quote, a number of Syrian towns, including the regional capital Raqqa, were reduced to little more than rubble. Human rights organizations reported that the coalition caused thousands of civilian deaths during the war. Hundreds of military assessment reports examined by the Times show the task force was implicated in nearly 1 in 5 coalition civilian casualty incidents in the region. This Task Force 9 was killing so many people that even the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, that has killed God knows how many people in assassinations, wars, and coups around the world, grew alarmed. CIA officers alleged that in about 10 incidents, the secretive task force hit targets knowing civilians would be killed. And then the rest of the article, they go into detail of how people like Colonel Korsak and Mr. Tate tried raising the alarm that a war crime had been committed, only to be ignored and stonewalled. At one point, they even fired Tate from the Inspector General's office and escorted him out of the building by security because he wouldn't stop raising the issue of this massacre.
Yes, I think you're right to say that it's one of the massacres, but this particular one, which came out in the New York Times, is of a village which is right on the border of Syria and Iraq at the Euphrates, just below Al-Bukamal, which is normally spoken of as the major town near the border there. And that's been it's been a hot point. Now, the US claims now that this was part of their final operations against ISIS. But this is a facade because we know really they have been backing covertly ISIS for many, many years. Joe Biden admitted it 7 years ago. That he admitted it indirectly that his close Arab allies were financing them. The head of the US military at that time, General Martin Dempsey, admitted that his close Arab allies were financing ISIS. And I myself went to a site in Deir ez-Zor 4 years ago where the year before the US and the Australians had bombed the Syrian army to allow ISIS to take over the mountain behind the airport at Deir ez-Zor. Now, the one we're talking about now, Al-Baghuz village, is on the Euphrates. It was March 2019. So, in other words, more than a year after all of the major operations were finished against ISIS, that ISIS was driven out of all of the major towns and cities of Iraq and Syria. And that was announced by General Qasem Soleimani, you might remember, who was the leader of that project. And also, by the way, the leader who decided to go from, after the liberation of Deir ez-Zor city from Daesh in October 2017, it was Soleimani that decided to go on immediately, straight away, down through Al-Mayadeen, down to Al-Bukamal and take control of the border there. And that border site around this village where we're talking about now, where the massacre took place, where the US admits the massacre took place, is where Iran has set up some facilities, some security facilities, which has been attacked many, many times by unknown forces, but presumably Israelis and the US. There's been missile strikes many, many times on the Iraqi and Syrian side of that border, the border crossing, which of course is the one border crossing that Syria and Iraq are still controlling, but it's under heavy fire. Now, it just so happens Al-Baghuz is right at that point. So there wasn't really, there certainly are bands of ISIS still around eastern Syria, but they've been effectively sheltered by the US occupation in eastern Syria. And to some extent, I was told this in Hasakeh that the Qassad, the SDF groups, which have a lot of ISIS prisoners, let groups out from time to time to go down for operations down near Deir ez-Zor and down in southeastern Syria. In fact, there was a petition by prisoners in one of the jails there. There was a type of insurrection, and they were demanding to go down to Al-Tant base, the US base, on the border of Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, because they thought the conditions were better down there, and the US was going to allow them to, participate in some other sort of operations there.
The United States claims that they're fighting ISIS during this time. I mean, they claim the same thing in Iraq, and we can see what happened to Mosul, to Raqqa also. I mean, they flattened these cities, really, and they've committed atrocities, war crimes, but they seem to get away with it, right? And there's this sort of hypocrisy here where when Syria is fighting terrorists, they say that Syria is indiscriminately killing civilians, but we don't hear that about the United States, right? It's as if there's always a good enough reason for them to do that. Do you feel there's a double standard there in how this is treated by the media and the politicians?
Well, certainly as regards the Western media, I mean, because they're very deeply embedded with the Western states, aren't they? Effectively, it's not permissible in Western countries to contradict fundamentally the narrative that the US has re-entered Iraq, for example, to fight ISIS. That has been a pretext. Of course, from time to time, they bomb people, they kill people. Also in Idlib, to some extent, every now and then they say they've killed an al-Qaeda leader there. But we know that NATO as a whole has been funneling aid and arms into that other side of northern Syria. Just make one other point about the Al-Baghuz, this village. As I said, Soleimani and the Syrian forces took control of that area and that border crossing in late 2017, just as the major occupation of ISIS was defeated. Now, that is the area that's been attacked many, many times. So ask yourself, 15, 16 months after that, when the Iranians, the Syrians, the Iraqi resistance were embedded in that area, why would there be any ISIS target there for the US to bomb? This is really, they wouldn't be a large aggregation of ISIS in that area anyway, because it's an area controlled specifically by the three powers, like Iran, Iraq, Syria. And of course, the incident that I documented a few years earlier around Deir ez-Zor was similar in a way. It shed some light on this. It was a case where the US and Australians, and I think the Danes, some others, went in, bombed the mountain behind Deir ez-Zor, which was controlled by the Syrian army, killed over 120 Syrian soldiers, claimed it was a mistake. It was a well-planned operation, but that operation allowed ISIS to take over the mountain to get strategic advantage at a time when there's still a battle going on for the city. This is in September 2016. Now, the US didn't come back and bomb ISIS on that mountain. They were very happy to leave ISIS there, and of course, as it turns out, they failed. They couldn't take over Deir ez-Zor city. So all of those operations in that part of Syria have been really clouded by this false pretext that the US was there fighting ISIS. I spoke to a senior general in Deir ez-Zor 4 years ago, General Shahada, and I said to him after he was explaining how, and this was reported in the Iraqi and the Iranian media a great deal, but of course not in the Western media, that there were these constant observations of collaboration between the US occupation and ISIS at that time. There was one other incident, and that was, he said that a group of Syrian soldiers were attacked and killed in the desert on one occasion there in 2017, and it was not possible that they could have detected them without satellite intelligence. So they believed that the US was providing satellite intelligence to ISIS too. And so I asked him if he thought he was fighting a US command there, and he said 100%. That the US was directing ISIS operations at that time. That's what the Syrians think.
It's absolutely incredible, all these examples. You know, it's almost too hard to believe, but this is effectively what's going on. Professor, just perhaps as a last question, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but you know, in Afghanistan, just when the U.S. was withdrawing from Kabul, you know, they drone striked the Ahmadi family and claimed it was an accident after investigating themselves. And then here again, the United States military investigates itself and finds no wrongdoing.
No, of course not. But this is what they do, isn't it? I mean, it's just they will always do it. You may recall the George Bush I said after they shot down an Iranian civil airliner, "I'll never apologize for anything the US does." Yeah. In Vietnam, we had the same experience. Basically, they even though they spoke of, you know, destroying a village to save it and those sorts of things, nevertheless, that level of cynicism has been there for a very long time through very many wars.
So much for America's checks and balances, right? So not only did the soldiers cover up their own crimes, but the commanders covered up their crimes, the bureaucracy covered up their crimes, even the grave itself was covered up. Literally, they covered it up using bulldozers. They razed the site and buried all the bodies so no one would find out. And of course, no one is held accountable for this, not one person. You can invade the land of Arabs and Muslims, murder them for no reason, and just get away with it. And then they talk about democracy and human rights, and they pretend that they are the civilized ones, and they will come teach us how things are done. The only thing being taught here is violence. The only lesson being drawn from this is that the United States will kill civilians with impunity on the other side of the globe and then cover it up from the soldiers all the way up the chain of command to the commanders and bureaucrats in DC. Look how long it took before we even found out about this. 2 years. They almost got away with it too. Can you imagine what else they are hiding? This is just the tip of the iceberg. They did this in Vietnam, they did this in Afghanistan. Just look, a few months ago in August, while they were withdrawing, the US murdered an entire family in Kabul with a drone strike. And for weeks they lied and pretended they had killed ISIS fighters. They had killed Daesh-K. You think they would have admitted to the murder if the media hadn't brought it up like they did now with Syria? Never. The whole war on terror is a lie. Fighting Daesh, also a lie. The whole war on Syria, based on lies. Look at the normalization and the lessons from that. One day they call it Assad a dictator, the next they say he's an Arab brother. This shows you how politics is all theater. From one second to the next, they flip like that. Nothing changed except their interests and whether their masters in Washington, D.C. gave them the okay. And these strikes, these massacres, no civilized person can accept this barbarism. No one can tolerate this foreign aggression and violence. Nobody. There's nothing democratic or humane about these bombs. There is no such thing as precision or limited strikes. These are massacres, bloodbaths. And anyone saying otherwise is either a fool or a liar. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is The Communiqué.